All right, so I'm going to go a little further. Oh, sorry, that was my fault. Take a look at another selection. This is Maddie Christensen's from last semester, using smoke to capture it, and then again this will be a fast shutter speed. We just got done looking at the first one was a fast. This is smoke captured with a fast shutter speed. Her version of fast shutter speed is going to be 1/400th of a second for this smoke. She's out in broad daylight. If you can see the ISO down here is set at 1600. That may have been overkill because, again, you're shooting out in broad daylight. Typically, you don't normally leave the triple digits if you're outside during daylight hours. Photoshop file added some warmth to that. And this one, I think this is a little colder. Changing those color tones does add some warmth. I think this is kind of interesting as well. Follows the rule of thirds pretty well as it stays on the left, I guess, the left third area as we're looking at this. Scroll down a little bit further. Again, popular subject as we're seeing for shutter speed is water. We're looking at Daniels right here, and what's nice about Bridge is it also shows us information on the Photoshop file. So also, shot at f/22, and he had a 1/2 second exposure. I think this is really, really interesting and really calming. Go over to the left a little bit. You see it's a little bit colder, and the Photoshop file added in some additional colors. So we start right here. He has a really low ISO, which I think is probably a good choice as well, considering, again, you're outside and shooting in daylight with such, like I say, with such a slow shutter speed. Again, slow shutter speed means your shutter is open for a really long time. A lot of light is coming in through the shutter. So we need that hole that it's coming through to be as small as possible. I think this is another interesting one. I know one of the previous videos just talks really lightly on, or rather I had that sheet included out there when it comes to lighting. So this would be considered backlighting. We get that hardened silhouette. If we look at the original actually looks pretty close to the Photoshop file. There wasn't a lot of color conversion. It's more or less as shot. See a really small F number, and because we're almost in the dark, it's kind of required because we got to let in a lot of light that's not existing, especially because it's being paired with a fast shutter speed to capture this person in the dark. So I think this is probably a rather difficult image to shoot. Another 10 minutes and it would have been impossible because we need this fast shutter speed to capture this person essentially frozen on the swing up above. But we also need, conversely, enough light to come in. 10 minutes after this was shot, because it was shot at dusk, it wouldn't have been possible. I'll go down a little bit further. This is a good submission for slow shutter speed. You know, there are a couple things that I think could be worked out. Usually if you have an object, person, thing moving through your image, you'd like to leave more lead space in front of them than behind them. This one's kind of centered right in the middle. So if you could picture it, let's pretend that this is the very back end of the photograph where it ends right here and it crops into right here. It essentially leaves more space for it to run off the page. That would make a little bit more sense. This is more kind of centered and almost skewed to the side where it has less space in front of it. It would, I think, look a little bit more awkward if the image ended right where my cursor is going and essentially the car is running off the page. So if you have objects, things, people running through your photograph, leave them space to run into. I think it looks a little less awkward when we're reading them just visually. It'll look better if you follow that as a kind of a composition tool or thought as well. Again, this is a use of panning or tracking of subject. So Jacqueline, we can see that her setting is at 1/25th of a second. That's pretty slow. She's following along with this car. I know this is at the Dunn County Raceway, and she's literally following along with it. Kind of a difficult spot to shoot in as well because she's sitting in the grandstands, trying to shoot through a chain link fence, essentially in the dark, but there are these big stadium lights, and following along with this car. So there is a level of difficulty to this, given where she was sitting. So again, that 1/25th of a second, that's pretty slow. And then she found kind of a middle f-stop number as well. ISO is a little high, but it kind of has to be because, again, you can see the skyline up here. She's shooting in the dark. Go down a little bit further. Another example of panning or tracking. This student you know, you half press the shutter down as he's getting a hold and tracking this motorcycle as it's driving along. Because obviously, I know the Earth moves, but not at this speed, and that's what makes those horizontal lines appear as they're going through the image. Like, this is a really interesting example. Pretty well done as well, keeping that, again, we're talking about leaving space for objects or things to run through your image. There's plenty of space in front of here for it to run through. Ends up falling. We're looking at the people. They almost fall exactly at an intersecting point in the rule of thirds as well. I think this is pretty well set up, especially because I know these are strangers. He's literally waiting on the side of the road to take pictures. If you have the opportunity and you're trying to shoot vehicles, if you know that you can work with somebody, it may be a lot easier than trying to shoot just random vehicles that are coming down the roads at variable speeds as well. All right, going in a really popular area. So cars and water, extremely popular for this first project. This is motion blur. We're looking at this at 1/8 of a second. Middle ground when it comes to F number. Nice low ISO because this is shot, this is actually shot from, I think, in the spring semester before. Actually, I lied. This is from just this previous fall. So we have f-stop of 7.1, a slow shutter speed, which gets us this glassy effect with the water, and a nice low ISO. This photo always makes me chuckle. This is a self-portraiture series. This is Matt from last year as well. We're looking at, we can see that there's slight difference into where his cropping occurred. Kept the aspect ratio pretty true, which is nice. On that first one, you're looking at what's missing. It's the guy tipping the bucket of water over on him. And we see all these individual droplets are literally just frozen in the air because it's at 1/1600th of a second. ISO at 800, perfect because he's outside. We can see it's daylight. And then an F of 4.0 because, again, he's has a really, really fast shutter speed. Shutter's barely open. So he needs what we call a wide open aperture with enough light coming in to compensate for these two. Again, on extremes, they are diagonal across from each other. For the fast shutter speed, diagonal across from each other, and then slight compensation with the ISO settings. I think it adds a really, really nice dramatic effect. And like I said, fun self-portraiture series. He, as we'll see further in the semester, if I end up using his as an example, he's the subject matter in the majority of his own work. So another example of water, you get that glassy effect. This is around town. I think this is out at Tripp Falls. That is outside of Menominee, Wisconsin. And this is the Photoshop version. Not much of a difference. Brightens it up, brings in a little bit more exposure light. I think this is a fun selection. I would say that the two images that you're putting together for these projects that are coming up don't have to be related in content. If it helps you and makes sense for your own flow, great. But they don't have to be related in content. They can be completely separate. You know, we'll see a lot of people pair up with, like, they're shooting water for a slow one, they also shoot water for a fast one. Not a requirement. Sometimes just the easiest thing when you're working through space and time for that. So I like to say that because I go into Stacy's selection. She took pictures at home. This is inside of her apartment. This is her fish tank. And I talked to her because I'm like, typically if we get shots that are taken inside someone's own home, you get to see all the stuff that's happening in the background that becomes part of the photograph that isn't really relevant to the composition. So her and I had a little chat. I'm like, hey, so how'd you get this how'd you get your background to be jet black? And she's simplest thing, literally took a black piece of tag board and put it on the other side of the fish tank. I'm like, that's kind of genius. It eliminates all the other noise that you'd have to try and figure out how to get rid of. And then it would take attention, most importantly, take attention away from your main subject matter. So this is her raw file, 1/400th of a second. This is one of those subject matters that we're not questioning if it's moving in real life. And this is the slightly edited version. So what we see right here, what got rid of, the corner of the fish tank disappears. And I think that was really easy because she already had a really a dark background to work with, and then brought out some more details in the lines of the fish. So I think this is a nice example, and then we actually see all the individual little oxygen bubbles that are floating around here as well. And I told her when I saw the submission for slow shutter speed, had I not seen the fish one first, I'd really have to figure out what this was. This is the filter. But because she used a slow shutter speed, and I think this is nice because she pumped up the clarity, with a 1/8 of a second instead of a 1/400th of a second, like the previous one, we get these interesting little lines that come out and they almost look like sparks. We know that they're water bubbles, and this is one water bubble as it's floating through, but with a slow shutter speed, we get this really interesting effect. So I think the editing on these, I think, really helped out the quality of them, but didn't end up going too far into being in the verge of digital art. So again, we're looking at 3.5 for an f-stop number. That lets in a lot of light. When you picture the number, the smaller the number, the more amount of light that comes in. And then we have the shutter speed of 1/8 of a second. So just to give you an idea on these. And that's because, again, she's shooting at a dark background of something that's dimly lit. All right, last couple examples that we have done here. And I like these right at the tail end. They are of water, but these images were really taken at the exact same location. They're the same students' work, so I'm going to look at both of them with extremely different shutter speeds. So take a look at Jason's first CR2 image, and we can see that really, again, low aperture to compensate for the fast shutter speed. And we had all this happening right here. We get all these individual droplets that are frozen in motion. This feels more or less chaotic. ISO, which I think is, probably unreasonably high. Most of you guys are still figuring out how to change the settings on your camera. Don't forget to change this. If you can get away with having an ISO that's much lower, err on that side. I think in error he left his just pumped in really high up. I think because I know he was shooting in daylight, go for something much lower than this many digits. I'd say triple at most. Like I say, a little bit higher, but I know he's shooting outside. But I think this is really interesting. Any of the digital noise might actually just get hidden in this background because it's so busy. So taken in the same spot, obviously much different shutter speed, we get a 1/4 of a second. So look at this conversely. 1/1000th, 1/4. And I think that's a pretty interesting contrast. I'm sure if I pulled up the metadata, these would be taken within a minute of each other, or however long it took him to change his settings. So I think this is really interesting to see the difference. And again, it gives you a different feeling when you view this. This is obviously a lot calmer. This does not make me feel calm at all inside. So start to consider what you want to do for a subject matter for this. What I think is really helpful, and you guys all have access to, if you go out to our Widen website and you take a look at some of the examples that were done in the past, like let me pull this out here really quick. And if I were to go out here, let's go ahead and type in shutter. I'm going to drop this down a little bit. You should be able to view a lot of images that were previously submitted for Shutter. Not all of them are great. You also see some of the videos if that's coming up as well. I didn't actually filter that out. So use this as a tool as well to go and view the additional stuff that was done. What I would suggest staying away from, or rather flat out don't submit images that includes box fans, I think are out for this project, as well as running water out of faucets or spigots. I think those are appropriate for that trial or that test run exercise that we have on the sheet, but not for a final project. So kind of start thinking creatively, start figuring out what you want to portray in here, and then again, these all portray some sort of story. It doesn't have to be very incredibly deep, but if we're looking at this, this is, or a sense of feeling. So this is a sense of chaos versus a sense of calm. I think they're distinctly different. So start thinking about that, start planning a little bit, take a meander through the website. Don't forget that we have the YouTube details and information. Those videos from last year out there are posted as well. Those have additional student information and projects in there. So that's it for the shutter speed. I'll be going into the details on the depth of field project shortly.